In here, we will be describing Trump, the psychology of outward projection in leadership and personal identity. The phenomenon of an individual masking their own medical vulnerabilities, cognitive decline, or physical disabilities by aggressively projecting those exact frailties onto others is a well-documented psychological defense mechanism rooted in profound insecurity and systemic denial. When a public figure or leader faces an internal crisis of health or capability, the instinct to protect a curated image of absolute strength can manifest as intense outward hostility, transforming personal panic into a weaponized political or social strategy. This behavior does not stem from a position of true authority or resilience, but rather from a desperate attempt to outrun internalized stigma and the deeply ingrained, flawed belief that human vulnerability is synonymous with absolute weakness. By weaponizing accusations of impairment against rivals or critics, an individual attempts to construct a psychological fortress, preemptively attacking the outside world to distract from the escalating decay within their own reality. This strategy of overcompensation relies heavily on creating a stark, artificial division between the self and the vulnerable population, forcing a narrative where the projector is uniquely robust while everyone else is fundamentally compromised. Underneath the superficial bravado and the relentless public attacks lies a fragile sense of identity that cannot withstand the weight of honest self-reflection or the public exposure of personal limitation. In high-stakes environments, particularly within modern political discourse, this defensive maneuvering is frequently deployed to manipulate public perception, shift media scrutiny away from glaring personal liabilities, and maintain an illusion of invincibility. It is a critical error to mistake this aggressive posturing for actual fortitude. Instead, it must be recognized as a classic fear-driven deflection designed to preserve power at all costs while actively punishing others for the very traits the projector is secretly terrified of embodying. This pattern of behavior ultimately erodes authentic leadership, replacing transparent governance with a toxic cycle of denial, projection, and hostility that inflicts collateral damage on the broader public discourse. When analyzing the motivations of figures who consistently resort to these tactics, observers must look past the loud, performative dominance and focus directly on the specific vulnerabilities being attacked, as the target of a projector's wrath is almost always a mirror image of their own deepest, unacknowledged fears. True strength requires the courage to confront personal limitations openly, whereas the reliance on outward projection reveals a desperate, losing battle against inevitable human vulnerability. The socio-psychological dynamics of exploitative wealth and class contempt the psychological evolution of individuals who amass extreme wealth through the direct exploitation of vulnerable populations reveals a systematic rewiring of human empathy and ethical consciousness. To maintain a position of social dominance without absorbing the psychological guilt of being the oppressor, affluent exploiters must actively reconstruct their worldview to rationalize the harm they inflict on the impoverished. Instead of confronting the uncomfortable reality that their financial gains are extracted from the desperate needs of others, they deliberately invert the narrative by projecting systemic failures onto the victims themselves. This defensive mechanism manifests as a toxic cultural mythos where poverty is framed as a personal moral failing, labeling the poor as fundamentally lazy, undeserving, and entirely responsible for their own economic marginalization. By pathologizing the working class, the wealthy elite successfully sanitize the act of economic extraction, transforming blatant exploitation into a seemingly justifiable byproduct of meritocracy. Furthermore, the insulation provided by immense power and concentrated capital creates a profound social distance that strips away human connection, reducing actual human lives, families, and communities to cold statistical data, expendable resources. Or mere losers in a competitive game, they believe they have righteously won. Beneath this performative contempt lies a deep-seated vulnerability and fear. acknowledging that the socioeconomic system is inherently rigged or that structural forces ruthlessly crush individuals would force the wealthy to admit that their own success is fragile, unearned, and illegitimate. To defend a highly volatile ego and protect their social standing from the threat of structural critique, they double down on public malice and systemic cruelty. In its most unvarnished form, this dynamic is driven by a primitive amalgamation of unbridled greed and a total deficit of basic human empathy, creating a psychological vacuum where the profound suffering of marginalized people simply fails to register as important when measured against the insatiable pursuit of personal profit and power. This pattern of class hostility serves as both an ideological shield and an active tool for wealth preservation, ensuring that systemic injustice remains unchallenged while the architects of exploitation insulate themselves from the human consequences of their actions. The anatomy of institutional protection and the weaponization of selective justice, the psychological and structural mechanisms deployed to protect powerful individuals implicated in horrific networks of abuse, such as the Jeffrey Epstein files, reveal an absolute breakdown of moral consistency in favor of self-preservation and systemic impunity. When figures of authority are tied emotionally, socially, or financially to abusers, their loyalty shifts entirely towards safeguarding their own social status and shielding themselves from legal or reputational consequences. This creates a severe state of cognitive dissonance, where individuals cannot reconcile their self-image as decent human beings with their active complicity in shielding predators, forcing them to aggressively distort reality, minimize the trauma inflicted on victims, and deliberately redirect public anger toward unrelated crimes or safer, marginalized targets. Within this protective matrix, deeply ingrained misogyny and a pathologically fragile need for control serve as highly effective tools, allowing these protectors to effortlessly dismiss, silence, and discredit victims, who are predominantly vulnerable women and young girls. To successfully maintain this facade of righteousness, these compromised figures frequently overcompensate by projecting an ultra-harsh, performative stance against petty offenses, utilizing a ruthless law and order mask to project public morality while selectively maintaining absolute blindness toward the severe atrocities committed within their own elite circles. Underneath this calculated web of deflection lies an intense undercurrent of fear and denial, driven by a savage willingness to sacrifice truth, justice, and human decency to preserve institutional power, proximity to wealth, and personal identity at any cost. Please feel free to follow, subscribe, comment, like, and share. This helps you to stay connected to me, and it helps me to remain here creating more content for you. Thank you, love always, Maria DC Santiago.